Welcome to the family, son.
What is going on, YouTube? This is Jim, back with another video, and today I want to talk to you guys about this gem right here. This is Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. I'm going to talk primarily spoiler-free. At the very end, I'm going to delve into a few story elements, primarily the DLC. I want to tell you guys up front that when I do get to the spoiler section, you'll know. So if you have not yet played the game and you stumbled across my channel, welcome. Do me a favor, subscribe. If you don't want to know anything about the game at all, do yourself a favor, turn this video off and come back to it long after you've beat the game so that you can relive the memories with me and we could talk about it in a hopefully civil discussion in the comments below. I have to say that I've played a lot of survival horror games, and Resident Evil was the first survival horror game that really was mainstream, that really made an impact on the industry. And over the years, I think we can all agree that Resident Evil has lost a lot of its luster. And thankfully, at Resident Evil 7, which somewhat acts as, I would say, a reboot to the entire franchise, with some character elements and plots carried over from previous Resident Evil games, does an amazing job of really redefining the genre that it defined so long ago with the original Resident Evil game. Now, if you do buy this game, I strongly encourage you to pick up the Gold Edition. That includes all the DLC, and you're going to need it if you really want to have a complete picture of what happens. I would argue that the End of Zoe DLC, which explains the Zoe character, which I'll get to in a little bit, and I'll talk about it in the spoilers section, probably is one you could avoid. But if you really want to know kind of the staple story, you really need to play the final piece of DLC, Not a Hero. Now, my understanding is that Capcom did for some time give this away for free. I'm not sure if that's still the case with the Gold Edition. It didn't matter to me because I had them all. But I'm a little frustrated that a game would segment a major piece of the final story into a DLC, and you're not, if you play the core game, no DLC, there are going to be some loose ends that are going to frustrate you. And that, if there's any criticism I can give of the game, it's that. But in terms of story, especially in terms of graphics, pacing, and a psychological fear that you will have legitimately playing this game, I really can't say anything bad about Resident Evil 7. And I would personally say, to me, it's the best survival horror game that I have ever played. Again, this is from a vet who's played through all of the Resident Evil games, all the Silent Hill games, Evil Within, Outlast. To me, this game is head and shoulders above the rest in terms of pure fear that you're going to experience when you play this game. And it has a lot to do with the fact that it's very realistic and it takes place in first person. Now, the first portion of the game, again, still not getting into spoilers, definitely deals more with a psychotic family. The second half of the game is where you're going to see more of the traditional Resident Evil tropes in terms of evil, bad corporation kind of stuff. But even then, I think it still does a really good job because, as with every Resident Evil game, you are always going to be outgunned and outmanned. And a lot of times, your best course of survival is to run or to hide or to frantically get what you need to get out of a room to run to the next room. And that's going to be extremely hard at the beginning of the game when you first are free and kind of walking through the house, particularly with the Bakers. The dad is one of the most ruthless, cunning, freaky bosses I think I've ever experienced in a game. His boss fight is absolutely ridiculously crazy. It definitely has a lot of gore to it. It definitely has an air of survival to it, and you really truly understand just how maniacal this guy is. This family, the Baker family, is nuts. They just flat out murder people. Their house is old and dilapidated and creepy. There are weird things around the house. There are doll heads around the house. There are severed body limbs. There are just bloody hooks. And it's very clear that these people live only to ruin other people's lives. They eat this nasty food, which has cockroaches and scorpions and centipedes. And they just seem content with flat out murdering and ruining people's lives. When you play as Ethan, you get a mysterious email from your wife who's been missing for over 3 years that she is at this house and she wants you to come rescue her. And when you show up, that is when all hell breaks loose. And I will admit, I had to play this game with the walkthrough. I would not play it at night, and it legitimately made me jump at least a dozen times. And I mean jump, scream, throw the controller in the air 3 separate times. My Xbox One popped open, the actual controller popped open, the batteries fell out of the controller, and the game would pause saying, hey, please insert the controller to continue, or connect the controller to continue. And I would look at the screen at this moment where I was afraid, and it was creepy. It like looked into my soul. You know, when you're walking around the house and you hear the bakers behind you, you know, the dad walking around with a shovel, dragging the shovel on the ground, or the mom with this creepy lantern, laughing maniacally and swatting at imaginary flies, and the son who's clearly just psychopathic. You read his journal about all these little boys and little girls that he's killed over the years and the pleasure he took in it. It's really hard to focus on the gameplay when you're just experiencing all these horrors. And I loved the way that this game handled the environment. The character development was fascinating, learning about the characters through cassette tapes that they had recorded, seeing some of the other victims, playing through some of the other victims' stories to kind of enhance your own understanding of the world was a really nice touch. You do ultimately play as Mia, and that's not a spoiler because it's very clear early on that you and Ethan and Mia are attached at the hip. You find her almost instantly, but she is not who she appears to be. Very early on in the game, she snaps. And when she snaps, she does some pretty horrific things to you. And this is where the supernatural element slowly kind of starts getting inserted into the game, but not in a bad way. Resident Evil has always had this kind of goofy campiness to it. And this game does suffer from that, especially later on in the game. But I think everything is believable when you take the context of the story, especially at the end when it all makes sense. You do some time jumps, both back in time and present day, and it really helps carve out the story. And I think it fits together really well. And the twist of kind of what is happening and why, I think is handled in a very, very, very good way. Characters that don't seem menacing turn out to be some of the most evil in the game. Some of the characters that appear to be evil actually are pretty much harmless. And as you go through and systematically, you know, try to escape and figure out what's going on and the horrors that you have encountered, only then I think do you really start to really get a good frame of kind of the nightmare that you're living. And I don't think it's very readily apparent, it wasn't to me at least early on, just how serious this epidemic was until later on in the game when you start to understand some of the ramifications of what happens. And I think your character, although mostly a silent protagonist, I think he does kind of start to understand that, you know, if I had the opportunity to leave and just leave this behind, it's something I can't do. It's something I have to stay and I have to finish this fight because of how serious things become. So with that, I'm going to end the spoiler-free section, and I just want to say that if you have not yet played this game, I'm giving it a ringing endorsement. It was clearly one of the best games that I have played in this. It's the best game I've played in this genre. I would argue it's on the top 10 of the best games I've ever played, just because it scratches that nostalgic Resident Evil itch, but it does it in such a creative and compelling way. And a game that makes me experience any emotion, whether it's happiness, sadness, fear in this case, that does it so well that resonates with me for time after time of beating it and thinking back on it and reflecting on it. To me, it really does set itself in a very separate category from other games where you play and go, oh, that was kind of neat, and you move on. Where I feel Resident Evil, at least for me, some of those jump scares will stay with me for quite some time. So with that, I'm going to jump over to the spoiler section, and I just want to talk briefly about the ending, and I want to talk about in particular where I think the franchise is going to go next. So if If you don't want to watch the spoilers, this is your chance to exit stage right. For everybody else, let's talk briefly about that ending. So, at the end of the game, it is very clear that the grandma, who has been docile the entire time, is actually the physical embodiment of Evie, the small girl that is raining terror on you. And there's a lot of really cool context clues in there discussing that she really is the villain, about how Evie is aging at an accelerating rate, and she just kind of lays there comatose. And when you put two and two together and the grandma appears at the end of the game and turns into this giant horror that you have to kill, it's really such a great moment because she's been so docile throughout the game, just watching over you. But it makes sense if you put it in context that Evie would want to have eyes on everybody in the house. The game does not do a very good job of explaining the serum that makes you invincible. Clearly, it's a byproduct of Evie, or it has something to do with her. I could have done without that. I mean, cutting her hand off at the beginning was incredibly freakish. Although I think they probably could have played on that more, and you not having a hand throughout the entire game, playing the game as a one-armed person, could have been interesting in its own right. There's a part in the game where you're being chased by the dad, and if you screw up, he'll actually cut your leg off, and you reattach it. I don't know if you necessarily have to see that. I mean, it may happen for you. That's not mentioned anywhere else in the game. It doesn't slow you down, just like your hand doesn't slow you down. Obviously, I don't think you play the game one-legged, but I feel like the one-hand thing could have been a cool twist on the game early on, but they didn't choose to go that route, and I guess that's okay. At the end, I would say that the story is pretty well wrapped up. You see the Umbrella Corporation come. You see Chris Redfield come. He cleans up the mess with you. The only frustrating thing about the game is that you don't understand the fate of Lucas, and that's where you need the DLC to dive in and kind of see that last little piece. And it's frustrating that it was kind of behind a paywall because his story was intriguing, although I don't think he got a great send-off as some of the other characters, particularly the dad, whose boss fight was absolutely hellacious. And I don't know how many times you seem to fight this guy before he finally goes down. He was definitely a tyrant. But, you know, playing with Chris Redfield in that final little piece, it was cool because you get to explore some of the more secret headquarter labby type, you know, being in a lab and test tubes and experiments. And that was really missing from this game. Most of it was just kind of supernatural thrown upon them. You did stumble a little bit into it early on, or not early on, towards the end of the game when you were in the frigate. But the reality is you never saw that evil test tube, you know, lab reports, pictures of people, really until you dived into Chris Redfield's story. And I feel like that's absolutely required to kind of get that final piece of the game. Don't know why it wasn't just included in the core experience. I really feel like it should have been. There's really no reason to separate that in any capacity. I mean, clearly you jump between Ethan, who is pretty much a bumbling idiot, against Mia, who starts with machine guns and remote bombs to pretty much sweep up the competition on the frigate. And you don't really, you know, you could have jumped easily to Chris Redfield in that capacity. They added in a couple little elements, like he had to find a better respirator and night vision, but I don't think that added to the story. I think you could have taken those elements out and inserted him better into the story. You probably could have had more chapters with him too, but that's more of a criticism than anything, and it's really frustrating, again, that it wasn't part of the core experience. Zoe, on the other hand, I actually chose to save Zoe. And I chose to save Zoe because Mia is a crazy-ass bitch. And I'll tell you that I was really dissatisfied with her arc. After you cure her and you're escaping, if you chose her in the story, she moves on, and after the boat capsizes, you have the flashback to Mia in the frigate. Zoe is never seen from or talked about again at the end at all. You have to play the DLC and play as, you know, Boxer Jack, which was just hokey, playing as a hillbilly who goes around and boxes people. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, and you haven't played the DLC, the final piece of DLC is called The End of Zoe. And you play as Zoe's uncle, brother to the evil villain, the evil baker. You play as his brother, who is a hillbilly who punches zombies. He doesn't have any weapons. He just punches them, eventually gets a bionic fist to punch through, you know, I keep saying zombies, molded, whatever. You punch through them, and that's how Zoe's story ends. She's cured, and everything's well, and all is good for her. And I feel like it was just kind of a cheap way to end her story. I feel like there could have been more done with her. In honesty, if you look at all the DLC, with the exception of Bedroom, which is a great flashback to some of the nonsense that poor cameraman had to go through, a really good escape the room, a literal escape the room puzzle game. That was really, really fun. You look at some of the other DLC, it just seemed kind of like throwaway. And I feel like maybe it was rushed a little bit. I know there were some delays in the DLC. I know some of it came a little later than it probably should have. That's why I mentioned earlier in the video that my understanding is Not a Hero actually was launched given for free, primarily because of how delayed it was. I don't know if that's the sole reason they gave it away for free or not, but I don't like that the DLC was so rushed. I feel like there was a lot more lore that they could have dived into, and maybe they could have done it in the core game. But even despite that, and I know it sounds like I'm picking on the ending a lot, the experience was so rich, and the characters that really mattered got the arcs that they truly deserved. And for that, I'm really satisfied. Nitpicking, like I said, maybe the DLC could have been tightened up a little bit better, maybe even completely removed and put into the core experience of the game. You know, seeing how all this kind of played out, they kind of tacked on this element at the end of Lucas selling the E-toxin to somebody, and I'm not really sure where that's going. I mean, I think clearly we can all say that that's going to be the hook to Resident Evil 8, that, you know, you thought everything was destroyed, but he did make a transaction at the 11th hour, and there are other people out there trying to weaponize this drug. So I guess maybe that's where they were going with it. But the reality is it just didn't seem like to flow very well with the core experience of the game. And the psychological element at the front, honestly, is unlike anything I've ever played, and I just can't praise that enough. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up this video. It's about 17 minutes or so. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the content, and if you made it to the end, congratulations. Do me a favor, subscribe to the channel, help me get back to 1,000. Hope you enjoyed my commentary and some of my thoughts on this gem, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. No joke, one of the best games I've ever played. Clearly the new definitive gold standard in survival horror games. If you disagree with my comment or my opinions, leave a comment below. Let me know what you guys think about it. I love to read your feedback and respond to you guys. I noticed with this game in particular, there are not a lot of YouTube videos doing spoiler type critiques on it. I'm not really sure why, because to me, it seems like it's such a gem. But I did my part. I did my video. Hopefully it spreads across the internet and more people watch it, and we bring this kind of genre back into the forefront. Because if you watched my Evil Within 2 review, you probably saw that I was a little more critical on the game than others. This game clearly head and shoulders above the rest. This should be the new definitive for survival horror games, and I hope that more games take some real emphasis and expand and refine and make this genre even better, because the first Resident Evil game was really unlike anything we played, and here we are years later playing Resident Evil 7, and I am once again completely blown away. And with that, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Get out there and survive your own psychotic outbreak, and until next time, I will see you guys on the other side.